The morning of September 14th started like any other Tuesday for Sarah Mitchell. Coffee at 5:30 a.m., uniform pressed to perfection, and her signature smile ready for another day, serving passengers at 35,000 feet. She had no idea that in less than 8 hours, she would be gripping the controls of a Boeing 737, desperately trying to save 147 lives with a plane that had no way to land safely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been flying with Pacific Airways for 11 years. At 34, she was one of their most experienced flight attendants, known for her calm demeanor and ability to handle even the most difficult passengers with grace. Her colleagues often joked that she could serve coffee in turbulence without spilling a drop, but today would test skills she never knew she possessed. Flight 892 from Denver to Seattle was supposed to be routine. The Boeing 737-800 was in excellent condition. Captain James Rodriguez had over 20,000 flight hours under his belt, and First Officer Lisa Chun was considered one of the sharpest young pilots in the company. The weather was clear. The passenger manifest showed a light load of 147 souls, and everything pointed to an unremarkable 3-hour flight. Sarah moved through the cabin during the pre-flight safety demonstration, her movements practiced and fluid. She had performed this routine thousands of times, pointing to exit rows and demonstrating oxygen mask procedures. The passengers barely looked up from their phones and laptops, assuming, like everyone else, that this information would never be needed. Seated in 14A was Dr. Marcus Thompson, a heart surgeon heading to a conference in Seattle. He was reviewing surgical notes, completely absorbed in his work. Behind him, in row 18, sat Elena Vasquez, a software engineer returning from a business trip, her laptop displaying lines of code that would have been incomprehensible to most. In the back of the plane, retired Air Force mechanic Bill Patterson dozed fitfully, his weathered hands folded over a worn paperback novel. None of them knew that their lives were about to become intertwined in ways they could never have imagined. First sign of trouble came 45 minutes after takeoff. Sarah was in the galley preparing the beverage service when she felt the plane shudder slightly. It wasn't unusual. Aircraft encounter turbulence all the time, but something about this particular vibration felt different. She paused, her hand on the coffee pot, listening to the subtle changes in engine sound that only someone who had spent years in the air would notice. In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez frowned at his instruments. A yellow warning light had appeared on the hydraulic system panel, indicating a pressure drop in the primary system. First Officer Chun ran through the checklist, her voice steady and professional as she read each item aloud. They had trained for this scenario countless times in the simulator, but real emergencies always carried an edge of uncertainty that no training could fully replicate. "We're showing a hydraulic leak in the primary system," Rodriguez announced over the intercom to the flight attendants. "Nothing serious yet, but we're going to run through some procedures. Keep the passengers calm and be ready for possible delays." Sarah acknowledged the call and continued with her duties, but a small knot of concern had formed in her stomach. Hydraulic problems could be minor inconveniences or major catastrophes, depending on their severity and location. She began mentally reviewing the emergency procedures she hoped she would never need to use. 20 minutes later, the situation escalated. The plane lurched violently to the left, sending unsecured items flying across the cabin. Coffee cups shattered against the windows, laptops slid from tray tables, and passengers who had been dozing jerked awake with startled cries. Sarah grabbed the nearest seat back to steady herself, her training immediately kicking in as she scanned the cabin for injuries. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom, carefully controlled but carrying an undertone that made experienced flyers sit up straight. We're experiencing some technical difficulties with our hydraulic systems. As a precaution, we're going to declare an emergency and divert to the nearest suitable airport. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The word emergency rippled through the cabin like electricity. Some passengers looked around nervously, others pulled out their phones to check for cell service, and a few began to pray quietly. Sarah moved through the aisles, offering reassurance and checking for injuries from the sudden movement. Her smile was genuine and calming, even as her mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Dr. Thompson looked up from his notes, his medical training making him acutely aware of the subtle signs of stress he was seeing in the flight crew. Elena closed her laptop and gripped the armrests of her seat, her engineer's mind automatically analyzing the sounds and vibrations of the aircraft. In the back, Bill Patterson was now fully awake, his military experience telling him that the crew's calm demeanor was more practiced than natural. In the cockpit, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The primary hydraulic system had failed completely, and now the backup system was showing signs of stress. Without hydraulic pressure, the pilots were losing control over critical flight surfaces, the rudder, elevators, and most importantly, the landing gear. "We've got a double hydraulic failure," Chun reported, her voice tight with concentration. "I'm showing red lights across the board. Landing gear, flaps, primary flight controls, we're losing everything." Rodriguez felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool cabin temperature. A double hydraulic failure was one of aviation's worst nightmares, a scenario that turned a routine flight into a desperate fight for survival. Without hydraulics, they couldn't lower the landing gear, deploy the flaps for landing, or maintain full control of the aircraft's attitude. "Get me Seattle Center," he ordered. "We need priority handling and emergency equipment standing by. And get the cabin crew up here. They need to know what we're dealing with." Sarah appeared in the cockpit doorway within minutes, her professional composure intact, despite the growing tension she could feel throughout the aircraft. Rodriguez turned to face her, and she could see the gravity of the situation written in his expression. "Sarah, we've lost both hydraulic systems," he said quietly, his words meant only for her ears. "We can't get the gear down, and our control authority is severely limited. We're going to attempt a belly landing at Seattle-Tacoma International. I need you to prepare the passengers for an emergency evacuation." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. A belly landing, bringing a commercial aircraft down without landing gear, was something she had trained for but never experienced. The survival rate was good if everything went perfectly, but perfectly was a relative term when dealing with a 150,000-pound aircraft sliding down a runway at high speed. "How much time do we have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. 2 hours, maybe less," Rodriguez replied. "We need to burn off fuel first. We're too heavy for this kind of landing. That gives you time to prep the passengers and go over evacuation procedures with the crew." Sarah nodded and turned to leave, but Rodriguez caught her arm gently. "Sarah," he said, his voice softer now, "I've been flying for 25 years, and you're one of the best flight attendants I've ever worked with. If anyone can keep those passengers calm and get them through this, it's you. We're all counting on you." She squeezed his hand briefly, a gesture that conveyed more than words could express, and headed back into the cabin to begin what would be the most challenging hours of her career. The fuel burn took precious time that felt like an eternity. Sarah used every minute to prepare both her crew and the passengers for what was coming. She moved through the cabin with quiet authority, checking each passenger individually, explaining the situation in terms that were honest but not panic-inducing. "We're going to make an unusual landing in Seattle," she told each person, her tone conversational and reassuring. "The aircraft is going to come down without the landing gear extended, which means we'll be sliding on the runway rather than rolling. It sounds more dramatic than it is. Pilots train for this scenario regularly." Once we stop, we'll be evacuating quickly through the emergency slides." Her calm confidence was infectious. Dr. Thompson found himself thinking about his patients, drawing strength from Sarah's professional demeanor. Elena began mentally preparing herself for the evacuation procedures, her analytical mind focusing on the mechanics of what needed to happen. Bill Patterson watched Sarah work and recognized the qualities that made exceptional people perform under pressure. As they approached Seattle, the emergency response was already in motion. Fire trucks lined the runway, their crews standing by, with foam cannons ready to suppress any fires that might break out during the landing. Ambulances waited in formation beyond the runway threshold, their paramedics checking equipment and reviewing mass casualty protocols. Air traffic controllers had cleared the airspace for miles around, giving Flight 892 priority over all other aircraft. In the cockpit, Rodriguez and Chun worked through their checklists with methodical precision. Every decision now carried the weight of 147 lives, and there was no room for error. The aircraft was responding sluggishly to their inputs, the lack of hydraulic assistance making every control movement a physical struggle. "We're committed now," Rodriguez announced to the cabin crew. 10 minutes to touchdown. Final preparations for landing. Sarah keyed the intercom for what she hoped would not be her final announcement as a flight attendant. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now beginning our final approach into Seattle. In approximately 10 minutes, we will be touching down without our landing gear. This is a procedure our pilots are trained for, and emergency crews are standing by on the ground. When I give the command, please assume the brace position, head down, hands on your ankles. After we come to a complete stop, we will evacuate using the emergency slides. Please leave all personal belongings behind and follow the illuminated exit signs." She paused, looking out over the faces of the passengers who had placed their trust in her and the crew. "I want you to know that everyone on this flight crew is committed to getting you home safely. We train for situations like this because we take your safety seriously. In a few minutes, this will all be behind us." As the aircraft descended through 5,000 feet, Sarah could see the foam-covered runway stretching out below them like a white carpet. The emergency vehicles looked like tiny toys from this altitude, but she knew that in reality, they represented hundreds of professionals whose only job today was to save the lives of the people on her aircraft. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The plane shuddered as Rodriguez fought to maintain control in the increasingly difficult conditions. Without the normal flight controls, every adjustment required careful coordination between both pilots. Chun called out altitude and airspeed while Rodriguez made minute corrections to their approach path. 3,000 feet, Chun announced. "Speed looks good. Approach is stable." In the cabin, Sarah made her final walk through the aisles, checking that every seatbelt was tight, every passenger was in proper position, and her crew was ready for the evacuation that would follow the landing. She caught Dr. Thompson's eye and nodded reassuringly. She squeezed Elena's shoulder gently as she passed. When she reached Bill Patterson in the back, the old mechanic looked up at her with a slight smile. "You're doing good, miss," he said quietly. "Real good." Sarah returned to her jump seat and strapped herself in, her mind racing through every possible scenario that might unfold in the next few minutes. She had done everything she could to prepare her passengers for what was coming. Now it was up to Captain Rodriguez to bring them down safely. But as Flight 892 descended through 1,000 feet, none of them knew that the real crisis was just beginning. The approach was textbook perfect until the final moments. Rodriguez had managed to keep the aircraft stable despite the control difficulties, and they were lined up perfectly with the foam-covered runway. Emergency crews watched through binoculars as the Boeing 737 descended toward what should have been a successful belly landing. Then, at 200 feet above the ground. Captain Rodriguez clutched his chest and slumped forward over the controls. "First officer." Lisa Chun's scream cut through the cockpit like a blade. "James! James!" She lunged forward, trying to reach the controls as Captain Rodriguez's unconscious body weight pushed the yoke forward, sending the aircraft into a steep dive toward the rapidly approaching runway. The Boeing 737 dropped like a stone. In the cabin, passengers who had been bracing for a controlled belly landing suddenly found themselves pressed against their seats as the aircraft plummeted at an impossible angle. Oxygen masks deployed automatically as the cabin pressure fluctuated wildly. Screams filled the air as luggage broke free from overhead compartments and became deadly projectiles. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the plane entered what could only be described as a controlled fall. Her training told her to remain seated until the aircraft came to a complete stop, but every instinct screamed that they were about to die if someone didn't act immediately. Through the small galley window, she could see the ground rushing up at them with terrifying speed. In the cockpit, Chun fought desperately to pull Rodriguez away from the controls, while simultaneously trying to level the aircraft. At 26 years old, she had logged impressive hours for her age, but she had never faced anything approaching this level of crisis. The captain's dead weight on the yoke was forcing the nose down, and without the hydraulic assistance they had lost earlier, she couldn't generate enough force to counteract his body mass and pull the aircraft out of its dive. "Mayday, mayday! Mayday!" she shouted into her headset, her voice cracking with strain. "Pacific 892. Captain is incapacitated. Aircraft in uncontrolled descent. Immediate assistance required." The air traffic controller's voice crackled back immediately. "Pacific 892, we copy your mayday. Emergency crews are standing by. What is your status?" "Captain is unconscious, slumped over controls. I can't pull him back." Chun's voice was raw with desperation. "Aircraft is nose down. I need help now." Sarah unbuckled her harness and launched herself toward the cockpit, her 11 years of experience in turbulent conditions allowing her to navigate the violently shaking aircraft. Behind her, she could hear Dr. Thompson shouting over the chaos, trying to calm the passengers while Alana Vasquez helped an elderly man who had been struck by falling luggage. The cockpit door was locked, as protocol required, but Sarah knew the emergency code. Her fingers flew over the keypad even as the aircraft continued its death spiral. The door clicked open, and she burst into the flight deck to see Chun pulling frantically at Rodriguez's shoulders while fighting to maintain any semblance of control with her free hand. "He's having a heart attack." Chun screamed over the howling of the wind and engines. "I can't move him and fly at the same time." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed Rodriguez under his arms and hauled backward with every ounce of strength she possessed. The captain was a large man, easily 200 pounds, and his unconscious body was pure dead weight. The aircraft's violent motions made it nearly impossible to get leverage, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she had. "Got him!" she yelled as Rodriguez's body finally came free of the yoke. Chun immediately pulled back on her controls, and slowly, agonizingly, the aircraft's nose began to rise. They were less than 300 feet from impact when the Boeing 737 finally started to level out, but their problems were far from over. "Sarah, I need you to help me." Chun gasped, sweat pouring down her face as she fought to maintain control. "The hydraulics are gone, and I can't manage all these controls alone. I need you to work the throttles while I handle the flight surfaces." Sarah stared at the bewildering array of instruments, switches, and controls that surrounded her. She had observed cockpit procedures thousands of times during her career, had even sat in the jump seat during training flights, but she had never actually touched the controls of a commercial aircraft. The thought of being responsible for the lives of 147 people was overwhelming. "I don't know how." she admitted, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "You're going to learn right now," Chun replied, her tone fierce with determination. "See those 4 levers? Those are the throttles. When I say power up, you push them forward. When I say power back, you pull them toward you. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, her hands trembling as she positioned them over the throttle levers. They felt cold and alien under her palms, but she gripped them tightly. Below them, the foam-covered runway was approaching again, this time at a more manageable angle, but they were still coming in too fast and too high. "We're not going to make it," Chun muttered, studying the approach. "We're too hot and too high. We need to go around and set up another approach." "Go around?" Sarah asked, not understanding the terminology. "Abort this landing, climb back up." "And try again," Chun explained quickly. "Power up, all the way forward." Sarah pushed the throttles forward, feeling the aircraft surge with renewed power. The Boeing 737 climbed away from the runway, much to the relief of the emergency crews who had watched the near crash unfold. But as they gained altitude, new problems emerged. Rodriguez was still unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Without medical attention, his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Dr. Thompson had made his way to the front of the cabin and was pounding on the cockpit door. "Let me in," he shouted. "I'm a cardiac surgeon. That man needs immediate medical attention." Sarah looked at Chun, who nodded grimly. "Open the door, but don't let anyone else in. We need the room." Dr. Thompson squeezed into the cramped cockpit space and immediately began assessing Rodriguez's condition. His face was grim as he checked for pulse and breathing. "He's had a massive heart attack. His pulse is weak and irregular. Without proper medical equipment, I can't do much, but I can try to stabilize him." "How long does he have?" Chun asked, not taking her eyes off the instruments. "Hard to say, maybe an hour, maybe less. We need to get him to a hospital as soon as possible." Chun nodded grimly. "Then we better get this plane on the ground. Sarah, we're going to set up for another approach. This time, you're going to help me all the way to touchdown." As they climbed back to approach altitude, Chun began teaching Sarah the basics of aircraft control. It was a crash course in the most literal sense. They had maybe 20 minutes to turn a flight attendant into a co-pilot capable of helping land a crippled aircraft. "The aircraft wants to fly," Chun explained, her voice steadier now that they had gained some altitude and breathing room. "Our job is just to guide it where we want it to go. The throttles control our speed and rate of climb or descent. The yoke controls our direction and attitude, nose up, nose down, left, right." Sarah listened intently, her mind working to absorb information that normally took months of training to master. She watched as Chun demonstrated each control input, explaining the cause and effect relationship between pilot actions and aircraft response. "The key to landing without gear is energy management," Chun continued. "We need to arrive at the runway with just the right amount of speed. Too fast and we'll overshoot or crash. Too slow and we'll stall and drop like a rock. Without flaps and with limited control authority, our margin for error is almost zero." Behind them, Dr. Thompson worked frantically on Rodriguez, using basic first aid techniques to try to keep the captain stable. He had moved him to the floor, behind the pilot seats, giving himself room to work while staying out of the way of the flight controls. "His condition is critical," Thompson reported. "We need paramedics standing by the moment we touch down." In the cabin, the passengers had settled into a tense quiet. Elena Vasquez had helped organize the uninjured passengers to assist those who had been hurt during the violent dive. Bill Patterson, drawing on his military experience, had taken charge of preparing the cabin for evacuation, checking that all the emergency equipment was accessible and that passengers understood the procedures. "Listen up, folks." Patterson's voice carried authority that commanded attention. "We've got a situation up front. But we also have two very capable people working to get us down safely. When we touch down, it's going to be rough, rougher than what they told us before. Keep your heads down, stay calm, and when those doors open, move fast but don't panic. We're all going home today." As they approached Seattle for the second time, Chun talked Sarah through each step of the approach. "Power back, just a little. Good. Now I need you to watch the airspeed indicator, that round dial there. Keep us between 180 and 200 knots. If it drops below 180, add power. If it goes above 200, reduce power." Sarah's eyes were glued to the airspeed indicator, her hands making small adjustments to the throttles as Chin had instructed. The aircraft felt alive under her touch, responding to her inputs in ways she had never imagined. Despite the terror of their situation, she found herself understanding, for the first time, why people became pilots. "You're doing great, Chun." Encouraged, natural pilot instincts. "Now as we get closer to the runway, I'm going to need you to help me with the final approach. The aircraft is going to want a balloon, float higher when we get into ground effect. When I say power, idle, pull all the throttles all the way back." The runway appeared ahead of them again, covered in foam and surrounded by emergency vehicles. This time, they were lined up properly, at the right altitude and speed for a successful belly landing. Chun's hands were steady on the yoke, making minute corrections to keep them on the center line. "Looking good," she murmured, more to herself than to Sarah. "Speed is good, altitude is good. We're going to make it." At 50 feet above the runway, everything changed again. A sudden gust of wind caught the aircraft, pushing it sideways off the center line. Without the normal control authority provided by the hydraulic systems, Chun couldn't correct quickly enough. The Boeing 737 drifted toward the edge of the runway, where the soft ground would mean certain disaster. "I can't hold it," Chun shouted, fighting the controls with everything she had. "The crosswind is too strong." Sarah could see the edge of the runway approaching through the windscreen. They were going to miss the prepared surface and crash into the grass and dirt beyond. In desperation, she did something that went against every instinct Chun had just taught her. She pushed the throttles forward, adding power when they should have been reducing it. The engines roared to life, and the additional thrust pushed the aircraft's nose around, forcing it back toward the center line. It was exactly the wrong thing to do according to normal procedures, but in this case, it was exactly what was needed. "Power idle now," Chun screamed as they crossed the runway. Threshold. Sarah yanked the throttles back, and the Boeing 737 dropped toward the foam-covered pavement. The main body of the aircraft hit the runway with a tremendous grinding sound, sending up showers of sparks as metal scraped against concrete. The plane skidded down the center line, slowly bleeding off speed as friction fought against momentum. A moment that seemed to last forever, they slid down the runway at tremendous speed, the aircraft vibrating and shaking as it fought to stay upright. Then, gradually, the massive Boeing began to slow. The scream of metal on concrete grew quieter, the vibration less violent. Finally, mercifully, Flight 892 came to a stop. In the sudden silence that followed, Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Chun sat back in her seat, her hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. "We did it," Chun whispered, her voice filled with wonder and exhaustion. "We actually did it." But Sarah was already moving toward the cabin door. "We're not done yet. We need to get these people out of here before something catches fire." The evacuation that followed would become a textbook example of how training and leadership can save lives in the most desperate circumstances. But as Sarah prepared to open the cabin door and begin the most critical phase of the emergency, she had no idea that her actions over the next 10 minutes would change not only her own life, but the entire aviation industry forever. The acrid smell of burning metal and electrical components filled the cabin, As Sarah rushed from the cockpit, smoke was beginning to seep through the air vents, and she could hear the ominous crackling sounds that every flight attendant dreaded, the early signs of a potential fire. Evacuate! 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 Sarah's voice cut through the stunned silence like a battle cry. Her training had programmed her to repeat the command 3 times, but her instincts told her there was no time for protocol. Everyone up! Move to the exits now! The passengers, still dazed from the violent landing, began to stir. Some moved quickly, understanding the urgency, while others sat frozen in their seats, overwhelmed by what they had just experienced. Sarah knew she had perhaps 3 minutes before smoke inhalation became a serious threat, and maybe 5 before the aircraft became a death trap. Elena Vasquez was already on her feet, helping an elderly woman in the row beside her. The software engineer's analytical mind had processed the situation immediately. They were alive, but they weren't safe yet. "Come on, everyone move," she called out, her voice carrying surprising authority. "Leave everything behind." Bill Patterson had positioned himself near the overwing exits, using his military experience to direct traffic. "You heard the lady. Move with purpose, but don't run. Help your neighbor." His commanding presence created order in what could have been chaos. Dr. Thompson emerged from the cockpit, his shirt covered in blood from his attempts to treat Captain Rodriguez. "I need 2 strong men to help me carry the captain," he shouted. "He's unconscious but alive." 3 passengers immediately volunteered, including a construction worker named Mike Stevens who had been sitting in the exit row. Together, they carefully lifted Rodriguez's unconscious form and began moving toward the front of the aircraft. Sarah sprinted to the forward exit door, her hands flying through the emergency procedures she had practiced thousands of times, but never performed in a real emergency. She yanked the door handle and felt the satisfying thunk as the mechanism engaged. The emergency slide deployed automatically, inflating in seconds to create a steep but viable escape route. "Jump feet first, arms crossed over your chest," she commanded as the first passengers reached the exit. "Don't hesitate, just go." The elderly woman, Elena, had been helping balk at the slide's steep angle. "I can't do this," she whispered, terror evident in her voice. "I'll fall." Sarah grabbed her hands firmly but gently. "Mrs. Williams. Dorothy Williams." "Dorothy, I'm Sarah, and I promise you're going to be fine. I've seen 90-year-olds go down these slides. Your body knows how to do this. Just sit down and let gravity do the work." Dorothy looked into Sarah's eyes and saw complete confidence. She nodded, sat down at the edge of the slide, and pushed off. She disappeared down the yellow chute with a small scream that quickly faded as she reached the ground safely. Elena appeared at Sarah's shoulder. "What can I do to help?" "Take over here," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Guide them to the slide. Keep them moving. I need to check the other exits." Sarah ran toward the rear of the aircraft, where smoke was becoming thicker. The overwing exits were operating smoothly under Bill Patterson's supervision, but she could see passengers struggling with the rear exit doors. Flight attendant Jessica Palmer, who had been working the aft galley, was unconscious, overcome by smoke inhalation. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed the portable oxygen bottle from the emergency kit and held the mask over Jessica's face while simultaneously trying to operate the rear exit door with her free hand. The door mechanism was damaged from the landing impact, and it wouldn't budge. "The door's jammed," shouted a passenger. "We're trapped back here." "No, we're not," Sarah replied firmly, setting down the oxygen bottle and grabbing the emergency axe from its mounting bracket. "Everyone stand back." She swung the axe at the door's window, and the reinforced glass exploded outward in a shower of fragments. The opening wasn't large enough for adults, but it would provide crucial ventilation and a way out for the smaller passengers if needed. "Can anyone here hotwire a car?" she called out, knowing it was a long shot. A teenager named Kevin Martinez raised his hand sheepishly. My uncle taught me when I was 12. Same principle, different application, Sarah said, pointing to the thighs. Doors control panel. Those wires control the door mechanism. Can you bypass the safety systems and get it open manually? Kevin's eyes widened, but he nodded and began examining the exposed wiring behind the panel. His fingers worked quickly, stripping wires and making connections while Sarah continued to clear smoke from Jessica's airways. "Got it," Kevin shouted, and the rear door suddenly swung open. The emergency slide deployed, creating another escape. Route for the passengers trapped in the back of the aircraft. "You just saved lives, kid," Sarah told him as she helped Jessica to her feet. The younger flight attendant was conscious now, but still struggling with the effects of smoke inhalation. Meanwhile, at the front of the aircraft, Dr. Thompson and his volunteer team were carefully maneuvering Captain Rodriguez down the emergency slide. The unconscious pilot needed immediate medical attention, but the rough ride down the slide was preferable to being trapped in a potentially burning aircraft. Elena had taken Sarah's advice to heart and was efficiently guiding passengers to the forward exit. Her software engineering background had given her a natural ability to see bottlenecks and optimize flow. Single file, help the person in front of you, keep moving. As the last passengers evacuated from the rear exit, Sarah made a final sweep of the cabin. Smoke was now billowing from the electrical panels, and she could hear the distant sound of emergency responders approaching the aircraft. But her job wasn't finished until she was certain every soul was accounted for. She found one last passenger, a young mother named Maria Santos, who was frantically searching under seats for something. "Ma'am, we need to go now." Sarah shouted over the increasing noise of alarms and emergency equipment. "My daughter's toy," Maria cried. "She can't sleep without it." Sarah grabbed Maria's shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. "Your daughter needs her mother alive more than she needs any toy. We're leaving right now." The simple truth cut through Maria's panic, and she allowed Sarah to guide her to the exit. They went down the slide together, Sarah wrapping her arms around the frightened mother to ensure they both landed safely. As Sarah's feet touched the ground, she immediately began counting heads. Her training had drilled into her the sacred responsibility of ensuring every passenger was accounted for. She moved through the crowd of evacuees, checking faces against her mental roster of the 147 souls who had been on board. "Everyone gather around," she called out, her voice carrying over the chaos of emergency vehicles and personnel. "I need to do a head count to make sure we're all here." The passengers, still in various states of shock and relief, began to cluster around her. Elena and Bill Patterson helped organize people into groups, making the counting process more manageable. Dr. Thompson was already working with the paramedics, who had rushed to treat Captain Rodriguez. 143, 144, 145. Sarah counted, her heart racing as she approached the total. 146, 147. Wait. She counted again, her stomach dropping. "We're missing someone." She grabbed the passenger manifest from her pocket. Somehow she had managed to hold onto it through everything and began calling out names. Every passenger responded until she reached one name, Thomas Chun. Silence. "Has anyone seen an elderly Asian gentleman, about 70 years old, wearing a blue sweater?" Sarah called out desperately. "He was in the back section," Maria Santos spoke up. "I remember seeing him during the landing. He was very calm." Sarah's blood ran cold. In the chaos of the evacuation, someone had been left behind. Without hesitation, she turned back toward the aircraft, which was now surrounded by firefighters spraying foam on the engines and electrical systems. "You can't go back in there," shouted Fire Chief Robert Murphy, grabbing her arm. "The aircraft is compromised. We'll send in a rescue team. There's no time." Sarah replied, pulling free from his grip. "I know exactly where he might be. and I can get to him faster than anyone else." Before anyone could stop her, Sarah was running back toward the aircraft. The forward slide had been deflated by the fire crew, but she knew another way in. She climbed up the maintenance ladder that the firefighters had positioned against the fuselage and entered through the overwing exit that Bill Patterson had used during the evacuation. Inside the aircraft, the smoke was thick enough to make breathing difficult, but not yet at lethal levels. Emergency lighting provided minimal visibility as Sarah made her way toward the rear of the cabin. Calling out Thomas Chun's name, she found him in the last row, unconscious but breathing. He had apparently been overcome by smoke while trying to retrieve something from the overhead compartment, a small wrapped package that lay beside him on the floor. Sarah grabbed the portable oxygen bottle from the rear galley and held the mask over Thomas's face while checking him for injuries. He was alive but would need immediate medical attention. Getting him out of the aircraft alone would be nearly impossible, but she had to try. "Help!" she called toward the open exit, hoping someone would hear her over the noise of the emergency. Response. To her relief, she heard footsteps on the aircraft floor. Kevin Martinez, the teenager who had helped fix the rear exit door, had climbed back into the aircraft despite the obvious danger. "I heard you calling," he said simply. "How can we get him out?" Together, they managed to lift Thomas and carry him toward the exit. The elderly man was small in stature, but unconscious people are deadweight, and the smoke-filled cabin made every step a struggle. At the exit door, 2 firefighters were waiting to help lower Thomas to the ground and into the waiting arms of paramedics. As Sarah finally exited the aircraft for the second time, she could see Captain Rodriguez being loaded into an ambulance, with Dr. Thompson climbing in beside him. First Officer Chun was standing near another ambulance, being treated for minor injuries and exhaustion, but refusing to be transported until she had spoken with investigators. Thomas Chun was rushed to a third ambulance, where paramedics worked to clear his lungs and stabilize his breathing. Sarah watched as the elderly man's eyes fluttered open, and she felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. "Is everyone safe?" Thomas asked weakly as Sarah approached his stretcher. "Everyone's safe," she confirmed, squeezing his hand gently. "All 147 souls accounted for." Fire Chief Murphy approached Sarah as the last ambulance prepared to leave. "That was incredibly brave and incredibly stupid," he said with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "You could have been killed going back in there." "He would have been killed if I hadn't," Sarah replied simply. "That's not acceptable." As the immediate emergency phase concluded, Sarah finally had a moment to process what had just happened. She had started the day as a flight attendant on a routine flight from Denver to Seattle. She was ending it having helped land a crippled aircraft and successfully evacuated every soul on board from a potential disaster. Elena Vasquez approached her as emergency personnel continued their work around the damaged aircraft. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Not just for today, but for showing me what real leadership looks like. I work with a lot of smart people, but I've never seen anyone think and act so clearly under that kind of pressure." Bill Patterson was next, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "Outstanding job, miss. I've seen combat veterans freeze up in situations less intense than what we went through today. You kept your head and saved lives. That's the definition of a hero." Dr. Thompson returned from the hospital later that evening with news about Captain Rodriguez. "He's stable and expected to make a full recovery." The paramedic said another 10 minutes without treatment could have been fatal. "Your quick action in the cockpit didn't just save the passengers, it saved his life too." As the sun set over Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Sarah stood looking at the damaged Boeing 737 that would never fly again. The aircraft had given everything it had to bring them home safely, and tomorrow it would be cut up for scrap metal, but 147 people, would wake up in their own beds because of what had happened on this runway. Federal Aviation Administration investigators were already on scene, beginning what would be a months-long investigation into the causes of the hydraulic failure and the unprecedented decision to allow a flight attendant to assist in landing the aircraft. The story would make international headlines, but for now, Sarah was content to know that everyone had survived. What she didn't know was that her actions this day would spark changes throughout the aviation industry, leading to new training protocols and emergency procedures that would save countless lives in the years to come. But that recognition was still in the future. Tonight, she was simply grateful to be alive and to have been able to bring her passengers home safely. As she finally left the airport and headed home, Sarah's phone began buzzing with messages from news outlets, family members, and friends who had heard about the emergency landing. But she turned off the phone and drove in silence, processing the events of a day that had changed her life forever. Tomorrow would bring interviews, investigations, and international attention. But tonight belonged to the quiet satisfaction of a job well done and the knowledge that when everything went wrong, she had found a way to make it right. 3 days after the emergency landing, Sarah Mitchell sat in a sterile conference room at the Federal Aviation Administration headquarters in Seattle, facing a panel of investigators whose expressions ranged from curious to skeptical. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as lead investigator Margaret Walsh shuffled through a thick stack of documents, each page representing a different aspect of what was already being called the miracle on runway 16L. Ms. Mitchell, Walsh began, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years in aviation safety. I want to be very clear about something from the outset. What you did 3 days ago was either the most heroic act in modern aviation history, or one of the most reckless violations of federal aviation regulations we've ever encountered. We're here to determine which. Sarah straightened in her chair, meeting Walsh's gaze directly. She had known this moment would come. The euphoria of saving 147 lives was now tempered by the reality that she had violated numerous FAA regulations by entering the cockpit and manipulating flight controls without proper certification. I understand the gravity of the situation, Sarah replied calmly. I also understand that Captain Rodriguez would have died, and the aircraft would have crashed if someone hadn't acted immediately. Dr. Amanda Foster, the aviation psychologist on the investigation panel, leaned forward with interest. Walk us through your decision-making process in those critical moments. What made you believe you could assist in flying a commercial aircraft? Sarah closed her eyes briefly, transporting herself back to that terrifying moment when she saw Captain Rodriguez slumped over the controls. I didn't think I could fly the aircraft, she said. I thought I could help First Officer Chun fly it. She was fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. The captain's body weight was forcing the aircraft into a dive, and without hydraulic assistance, she couldn't generate enough force to pull out of it. But you had no flight training, interjected Investigator James Morrison, a former airline pilot whose skepticism was evident. You made control inputs that could have killed everyone on board. The throttle adjustment during the crosswind landing, Sarah acknowledged. I know it went against everything Chun had just taught me, but I could see we were drifting off the runway. In that split second, I had to choose between following procedure and following instinct. Walsh consulted her notes. First Officer Chun's statement supports your account. She stated that your throttle input, while unconventional, was exactly what was needed to correct the aircraft's lateral drift. How do you explain making the right decision with no training? Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I've been flying as a passenger and crew member for 11 years. I've sat in cockpits during training flights, watched hundreds of takeoffs and landings, observed how pilots respond to different situations. I think I absorbed more than I realized through osmosis, Dr. Foster made a note. Unconscious competence through extended exposure. It's not unprecedented, but it is remarkable. The investigation had been thorough and unprecedented in scope. Never before had an untrained civilian been called upon to assist in controlling a commercial aircraft in flight. The FAA, the National Transportation Safety Board, Pacific Airways, and multiple international aviation authorities were all studying every aspect of the incident. The technical investigation had revealed that the hydraulic failure was caused by a manufacturing defect in a specific batch of hydraulic lines that had been installed during the aircraft's last major overhaul. The same defect existed in 17 other Boeing 737s worldwide, all of which were immediately grounded for inspection and repair. But the human factors investigation was far more complex. How had a flight attendant with no formal pilot training successfully assisted in landing a crippled aircraft? What did this incident reveal about emergency training protocols? Should flight attendants receive basic flight training for scenarios like this? Let's talk about the evacuation, Walsh continued, shifting to a new section of her investigation file. Your decision to re-enter the aircraft to search for the missing passenger violated explicit emergency protocols. Thomas Chung would have died from smoke inhalation, Sarah replied without hesitation. The fire department estimated it would have taken them at least 5 more minutes to locate and extract him. He didn't have 5 minutes, Morrison shook his head. You put yourself and others at risk. The teenager who followed you back into the aircraft could have been killed. Kevin Martinez made his own choice to help, Sarah responded firmly. And because of that choice, a 70-year-old man is alive today to see his granddaughter graduate from college next month. Dr. Foster looked up from her notes. Tell us about your leadership during the evacuation. Multiple passengers have described your performance as exceptional. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise. I was doing my job. Everything I did was based on training and procedures that every flight attendant learns. But not every flight attendant would have maintained that level of composure under those circumstances, Walsh observed. Elena Vasquez, the software engineer, has since applied for pilot training, citing your example as inspiration. Bill Patterson has written a letter to our department recommending you for a commendation. Dr. Thompson credits you with saving Captain Rodriguez's life through your quick action in the cockpit. The door to the conference room opened, and First Officer Lisa Cheen entered, having been called to provide additional testimony. She looked tired but determined as she took the seat next to Sarah. Officer Chen, Walsh began, you've had 3 days to reflect on the events. Do you maintain that Ms. Mitchell's assistance was necessary and beneficial? Chun didn't hesitate. Absolutely. Without Sarah's help, we would have crashed. There's no question in my mind about that. She pulled the captain away from the controls when I couldn't. She managed the throttles during the approach when I needed to focus on aircraft attitude. And her instinctive power adjustment during the crosswind saved the landing. Morrison remained skeptical. But she violated federal regulations by manipulating aircraft controls without certification. Regulations are designed to ensure safety, Chun replied sharply. In this case, following regulations would have killed 147 people. Sarah chose to save lives over following rules, and I support that decision completely. The investigation panel exchanged glances. This was uncharted territory for aviation regulation. The letter of the law was clear. Unauthorized personnel were forbidden from operating aircraft controls. But the spirit of the law was to ensure safety, and in this case, breaking the rules had saved lives. Dr. Foster addressed Sarah directly. Have you considered pursuing pilot training? Your performance suggests you have a natural aptitude for flying. Sarah was surprised by the question. She had been so focused on potential disciplinary action that she hadn't considered future possibilities. I haven't thought about it. My career has always been in cabin service. The aviation industry is changing, Walsh said, closing her file folder. This incident has sparked discussions about cross-training between flight crews and cabin. Crews, your actions may lead to new protocols that could save lives in future emergencies. Over the following weeks, as the formal investigation concluded, Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm she never could have imagined. News outlets from around the world wanted to interview the flight attendant who had helped land a plane. Aviation magazines wrote technical analyses of her decisions. Safety experts debated the implications for future training protocols. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Captain James Rodriguez, who had made a full recovery from his heart attack, requested a meeting with Sarah at his home in suburban Seattle. When she arrived, she found him in his study, surrounded by flight manuals and charts that represented 4 decades of flying experience. "Sarah," he said, standing to greet her, "I wanted to thank you personally for saving my life and the lives of my passengers." "You don't need to thank me," Sarah replied. "I was doing my job," Rodriguez smiled. "You were doing much more than your job. You were thinking like a pilot, acting like a leader, and demonstrating the kind of judgment that can't be taught in any classroom." He moved to his desk and picked up an official-looking document. "I've been authorized by Pacific Airways and the FAA to offer you something unprecedented. Would you be interested in entering an accelerated pilot training program? Your actions have convinced a lot of people that you have the right stuff to be in the cockpit." Sarah stared at the document in amazement. 6 months earlier, she had been a flight attendant content with her career in cabin service. Now she was being offered the opportunity to become a commercial pilot based on a single day of crisis performance. The program would fast-track you through private pilot, instrument rating, commercial license, and eventually airline transport pilot certification, Rodriguez explained. "It's never been done before, but then again, what you did has never been done before either." As Sarah considered the offer, she thought about Elena Vasquez, who had indeed enrolled in pilot training after being inspired by the emergency. She thought about Kevin Martinez, who had been offered a full scholarship to study aerospace engineering. She thought about all the passengers who had found their lives changed by a single day of crisis and heroism. The formal FSA ruling came 2 months later. After extensive deliberation, the panel determined that while Sarah's actions had technically violated federal aviation regulations, the circumstances were so extraordinary and the outcome so positive that no disciplinary action would be taken. Instead, they recommended that her case be studied as a model for future emergency response protocols. More significantly, the FAA announced new regulations requiring enhanced emergency training for flight attendants, including basic aircraft systems familiarization and crisis decision-making scenarios. Sarah's actions had fundamentally changed how the aviation industry thought about emergency preparedness. The aircraft itself, Boeing 737 tail number N892PA, was declared a total loss. But rather than being scrapped immediately, it was donated to an aviation training facility where future pilots and flight attendants would train on the same type of aircraft that had tested the limits of human courage and skill. Elena Vasquez completed her private pilot license and sent Sarah a photo of herself standing beside a small Cessna, wearing a huge smile and a pilot's headset. The accompanying note read, "Thanks for showing me what's possible when someone refuses to accept that something can't be done." Dr. Thompson returned to his surgical practice but volunteered his time to help develop new medical emergency protocols for commercial aviation. His experience treating Captain Rodriguez in the confines of a crippled aircraft led to improved first aid training for flight crews and better medical equipment. Placement on commercial aircraft. Bill Patterson started a non-profit organization focused on emergency preparedness training for civilian populations, using the lessons learned from Flight 892 to help communities prepare for disasters. His motto, borrowed from Sarah's example, was simple: stay calm, help your neighbor, and never leave anyone behind. Thomas Chun, the elderly passenger whose rescue had nearly cost Sarah her life, became an advocate for aviation safety improvements. At 70 years old, he testified before Congress about the importance of passenger safety training and the heroism of flight crews who go above and beyond their duties. As Sarah stood in Captain Rodriguez's study, holding the pilot training offer in her hands, she realized that September 14th had been more than just a day of crisis and survival. It had been a day that revealed who she really was and what she was capable of becoming. The investigation was over. The media attention was beginning to fade. The formal recognition and awards would continue for months to come. But the most important outcome wasn't found in any official report or regulation change. It was found in the simple knowledge that when everything went wrong, when lives hung in the balance, when impossible decisions had to be made in seconds rather than hours, she had found a way to save everyone. Not because she was trained for it, not because she was prepared for it, but because she refused to accept that anyone had to die on her watch. The offer to become a pilot represented a new chapter in her life, one that would be shaped by the lessons learned at 35,000 feet on a day when an ordinary flight attendant discovered she had the heart of a pilot and the soul of a hero. But first, she had one more flight to take as a flight attendant, a memorial flight for the Boeing 737 that had given everything to bring them home safely. It would be her final flight in the cabin before beginning her journey to the cockpit, a fitting end to one career and the beginning of another. 6 months after the emergency landing, Sarah Mitchell stood in the crew briefing room at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, wearing her Pacific Airways uniform for what would be the final time. The memorial flight for N892PA had been her idea, a chance for the survivors to see the aircraft one last time before it was permanently retired and moved to the training facility. The passenger list was small but meaningful. Elena Vasquez had flown in from San Francisco, where she was now halfway through her accelerated pilot training program. Dr. Marcus Thompson was there with his wife, carrying a small plaque honoring Captain Rodriguez's recovery. Bill Patterson had driven up from Portland with 3 of his emergency preparedness volunteers. Thomas Chun, the elderly passenger Sarah had rescued, sat quietly in the front row with a wrapped gift he insisted on presenting to her personally. Kevin Martinez, now 18 and enrolled at the University of Washington studying aerospace engineering, bounced nervously in his seat. This was only his second time on an airplane since the emergency, and despite his heroic actions that day, he still felt anxious about flying. "Different plane, different day," Sarah assured him as she performed her final pre-flight safety demonstration. "This one has all its hydraulics working perfectly." The Boeing 737-800 they were flying today was identical to the aircraft they had survived in, but this one would complete a simple 30-minute flight pattern over the Puget Sound before returning safely to Seattle. Captain Rodriguez, now fully recovered and cleared to return to flying, had volunteered to pilot the memorial flight himself. First Officer Lisa Chun occupied the right seat once again, but this time with a profound difference in perspective. Over the past 6 months, she had become an advocate for expanded emergency training, speaking at aviation conferences about the lessons learned from Flight 892. Her partnership with Sarah during the crisis had forged a friendship that transcended normal crew relationships. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom as they reached cruising altitude. 6 months ago, this aircraft type faced its greatest test. Today, we fly in memory of N892PA and in celebration of the 147 souls who survived because extraordinary people did extraordinary things. As they flew over the Olympic Mountains, Sarah moved through the cabin one final time as a flight attendant, checking on each passenger and sharing memories of that September day. But these conversations were different from her usual passenger interactions. These people had shared an experience that bonded them in ways that transcended normal social boundaries. Elena looked up from the aviation textbook she was studying during the flight. "I have something to tell you," she said quietly. "I passed my commercial pilot written exam yesterday. Scored 95%. My instructor said it was one of the highest scores he's ever seen from someone with so few flight hours." Sarah felt a surge of pride. "That's incredible, Elena. You've come so far in such a short time. I keep thinking about what you said during the evacuation, about leadership being more than giving orders. It's about seeing what needs to be done and having the courage to do it, even when you're scared." Elena closed her textbook and looked directly at Sarah. "I'm scared every time I get in the cockpit, but I do it anyway because you showed me that fear doesn't have to stop you." Dr. Thompson was reviewing medical journals when Sarah reached his row. "Still working on improving aviation medicine?" she asked. "Always," he replied with a smile. "The protocol changes we've implemented because of your emergency have already saved lives. Last month, a flight attendant in Dallas used the enhanced medical training to stabilize a passenger having a stroke until they could make an emergency landing. The passenger made a full recovery." Bill Patterson was showing his volunteers photos from their latest disaster preparedness training exercise. "We're up to 15 communities now," he reported proudly, "teaching the same principles you demonstrated. Stay calm, help your neighbor, never leave anyone behind. Simple concepts, but they save lives when people remember them under pressure." Thomas Chun was perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. The quiet elderly man who had nearly died from smoke inhalation had become a passionate advocate for passenger safety education. He now traveled to aviation conferences, sharing his story and emphasizing the importance of paying attention to safety briefings. "I brought you something," he said, handing Sarah the wrapped package he had been carrying. Inside was a beautiful wooden model of a Boeing 737, crafted with incredible detail and precision. "I made this myself. It's N892PA, exactly as she was." On September 14th, Sarah examined the model, noting the accurate paint scheme, the correct registration numbers, and even tiny details like the emergency slides and their deployed positions. "Thomas, this is beautiful. You made this yourself?" "Woodworking is my hobby," he explained. "I've been working on it for months, trying to get every detail right. I wanted to create something that honored what that aircraft did for us. She gave her life to save ours." The memorial flight continued over the stunning landscape of Washington State, but Sarah found herself thinking about the future rather than the past. Tomorrow she would begin her formal pilot training at Pacific Airways Flight Academy. The accelerated program would compress years of traditional training into an intensive 18-month curriculum designed specifically for her unique background and demonstrated abilities. The program was unprecedented in commercial aviation. Never before had an airline created a customized training track for someone with Sarah's combination of extensive aviation exposure and proven crisis performance. Industry experts from around the world would be watching her progress, studying whether experience and natural ability could substitute for traditional flight training pathways. Captain Rodriguez's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Sarah, would you join us in the cockpit for the approach back to Seattle?" She made her way forward, passing the galley where she had served thousands of cups of coffee over 11 years, passing the jump seat where she had watched hundreds of takeoffs and landings, passing the emergency equipment she had hoped never to use, but had deployed to save lives. In the cockpit, Rodriguez gestured to the observer seat behind the pilots. "I thought you might like to see this approach from a different perspective." As they descended towards Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Sarah watched Chun and Rodriguez work together with the smooth coordination that came from years of training and experience. But she also noticed things she had never seen before: the subtle control inputs, the constant cross-checking of instruments, the quiet communication between pilot and co-pilot. "Runway 16L in sight," Chun reported, and Sarah felt a chill. It was the same runway where they had made their emergency landing 6 months earlier. Tower, Pacific 1147 requesting a low approach over runway 16L before landing on 16R, Rodriguez radioed. Pacific 1147, cleared for low approach runway 16L, then circled to land 16R. As they flew low over the runway where N892PA had ended her flying career, Sarah could see the slight discoloration in the concrete where metal had scraped against pavement. The runway had been repaired and returned to service, but the scars remained visible to those who knew where to look. "That's where we stopped," Rodriguez said quietly, pointing to a specific spot on the runway. "Right there, where the concrete is slightly different. That's where 147 people got a second chance at life." They circled around and landed normally on the parallel runway, but even this routine landing felt significant to Sarah. It was her final landing as a flight attendant and her symbolic first step toward becoming a pilot. After the passengers had disembarked, Sarah stood alone in the empty cabin one last time. The seats were the same, the overhead compartments identical to thousands she had opened and closed, the emergency equipment familiar from years of training. But everything felt different now. Elena was waiting for her at the gate, having delayed her return flight to San Francisco. "I wanted to give you this," she said, handing Sarah a small wrapped package. Inside was a pair of pilot's wings, not the standard issue wings given to new pilots, but vintage wings from the early days of commercial aviation, when flying was still more adventure than routine transportation. "They belonged to my grandfather," Elena explained. "He was one of the first commercial pilots in the Philippines in the 1950s. He always said that the best pilots weren't necessarily the ones with the most training, but the ones with the most courage. I think he would have wanted you to have them." Sarah pinned the wings to her uniform jacket, feeling the weight of history and responsibility they represented. "Thank you, Elena. This means more than you know." Dr. Thompson approached with his own farewell gift, a letter of recommendation for Sarah's pilot training program. "I've written to the chief flight instructor about your performance under pressure," he said. "Medical professionals and pilots share many similarities. We both need to make life or death decisions quickly and accurately. You've proven you can do that." Bill Patterson's goodbye was characteristically direct. "You're going to make an outstanding pilot," he said simply. "But more importantly, you're going to be the kind of pilot who remembers that the job is about serving others, not just flying airplanes." Thomas Chun was the last to say goodbye. The elderly man who had nearly died in the smoke-filled cabin now stood straight and strong, his eyes bright with purpose. "I have one final gift," he said, pulling out a small envelope. "It's a letter from my granddaughter. She's applying to become a pilot herself, inspired by your story. She wanted to thank the woman who saved her grandfather so he could walk her down the aisle at her wedding next year." As the memorial flight passengers dispersed to their various destinations, Sarah found herself alone with Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chun in the empty gate area. These two people had shared the most intense experience of her life, and their continued friendship represented something precious and irreplaceable. "Any second thoughts about pilot training?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. The path ahead would be challenging, intensive ground school, countless hours in flight simulators, check rides and evaluations that would determine whether she had what it took to command a commercial aircraft. There would be skeptics who questioned whether her emergency performance was luck or skill. There would be pressure to prove that she deserved the opportunity she had been given. "No second thoughts," she replied firmly. "But I want to make sure I do this for the right reasons. Not because of the media attention or the recognition, but because I can genuinely contribute to aviation safety and passenger welfare." Chun smiled. "That's exactly why you're going to succeed. You're not doing this for glory. You're doing it because you want to serve others. That's the foundation of good piloting. As they walked toward the parking garage, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a competent but unremarkable flight attendant. A hydraulic failure and a medical emergency had transformed her into a symbol of courage and competence under pressure, but the real transformation hadn't been in how others saw her. It had been in how she saw herself. She had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, faced fears she never imagined confronting, and found the strength to make decisions that saved lives. The pilot training ahead would be rigorous and demanding, but it would be building on a foundation of proven performance. Under the ultimate pressure, she had already demonstrated that she could think clearly and act decisively when lives hung in the balance. Everything else was just technique and procedure. As she drove home that evening, Sarah passed the aircraft maintenance hangar where N892PA now sat. Her flying days over, but her legacy secure. The aircraft would soon be moved to the training facility, where future pilots and flight attendants would learn from her example. Students would study the emergency procedures, analyze the decision-making process, and prepare for their own moments of crisis. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter, not just for Sarah, but for the entire concept of how aviation professionals are trained and prepared for emergencies. Her story had already changed industry standards and inspired a new generation of aviation professionals. Now she had the opportunity to continue that impact from the cockpit rather than the cabin. The transformation from flight attendant to pilot would take 18 months of intensive training. But the transformation from ordinary person to someone capable of extraordinary actions under pressure, that had taken just a few hours on a September afternoon when everything went wrong and someone had to make it right. As Sarah pulled into her driveway, she looked up at the clear evening sky where aircraft traced their paths between destinations, each one carrying passengers who trusted their crews to bring them home safely. Soon, she would be among the pilots shouldering that responsibility, carrying forward the lessons learned on the day when a routine flight became a test of everything that matters in aviation: skill, courage, teamwork, and the unwavering commitment to never leave anyone behind. The memorial flight was over, but the real journey was just beginning. 18 months later, Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her newly earned pilot's wings one final time before stepping into the cockpit of Pacific Airways Flight 2847, bound for Denver. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was flying the reverse route of the flight that had changed her life, but this time she would be the one responsible for bringing 162 passengers safely to their destination. The Boeing 737 MAX aircraft was state-of-the-art, equipped with redundant hydraulic systems and advanced safety features that had been developed partly in response to incidents like Flight 892. As she completed her pre-flight checklist, Sarah's co-pilot, First Officer David Park, reviewed the weather conditions and flight plan with the methodical precision that had made him one of Pacific Airways' most promising young pilots. "Captain Mitchell," Park said, still adjusting to working with someone whose path to the cockpit had been so unconventional, "I have to ask, are you nervous about this first flight as pilot in command?" Sarah considered the question as she tested the flight controls, feeling the responsiveness that had been absent on that September day nearly 2 years ago. "Every pilot should be a little nervous," she replied. "The moment we stop respecting the responsibility we carry, we become dangerous. But no, I'm not nervous about flying. I'm excited about it." The passenger boarding process was routine, but Sarah found herself watching the gate area through the cockpit window with different eyes than she'd had as a flight attendant. She could see families saying goodbye, business travelers checking their phones one last time, and elderly couples helping each other with their carry-on bags. Each person represented a life that she and David were responsible for protecting. Among the passengers boarding Flight 2847 was a familiar face that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Elena Vasquez, now wearing the uniform of SkyWest Airlines with 3 stripes on her shoulders, was deadheading to Denver for her own flight assignment. The software engineer who had helped during the emergency evacuation was now second officer. Vasquez, having completed her own accelerated pilot training and beginning her airline career. "Captain Mitchell," came the voice of the head flight attendant over the intercom. "We have a special passenger today who's requested to speak with you before departure." Sarah exchanged glances with David, who nodded his approval. She made her way back to the cabin, where Elena was waiting with a huge smile and tears in her eyes. "I can't believe it," Elena said, embracing Sarah warmly. "Captain Mitchell. It has such a nice ring to it." "Second Officer Vasquez doesn't sound too bad either," Sarah replied, noting Elena's crisp uniform and the confidence in her bearing that had replaced the analytical uncertainty of 18 months ago. "I'm deadheading to Denver for my first international route assignment," Elena explained proudly. "Mexico City tomorrow morning. My instructor says I'm ready, but honestly, I keep thinking about what you taught me during the evacuation, that fear doesn't have to stop you if you remember your training and focus on helping others." As they talked, other passengers began to notice the reunion. Word spread quickly through the cabin that their captain was Sarah Mitchell, the flight attendant who had become famous for helping land Flight 892. Several passengers asked for selfies, but Sarah politely declined, explaining that her focus needed to be on their safe flight today. Back in the cockpit, Sarah ran through her final checks with renewed purpose. The weight of command was different from anything she had experienced as a flight attendant. Then, she had been responsible for passenger comfort and safety within the cabin. Now she was responsible for every decision that could affect the outcome of the flight. "Pacific 2847, you're cleared for takeoff, runway 16L, came the voice of the tower controller. Runway 16L, the same runway where N892PA had made its emergency landing 20 months earlier. Sarah felt a moment of profound connection to that day. As she advanced the throttles and felt the Boeing 737 MAX accelerate down the same strip of concrete, where she had learned what she was truly capable of, the takeoff was flawless, the aircraft climbing smoothly into the clear Washington sky. As they passed through 10,000 feet, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The 18 months of intensive training had been the most challenging period of her life. Ground school that compressed years of aviation knowledge into months of study. Simulator sessions that tested every aspect of pilot decision-making. And check rides that determined whether she had earned the right to command a commercial aircraft. There had been moments of doubt, particularly during the early weeks when she struggled with advanced navigation systems and complex weather theory. Some of her classmates, traditional pilot candidates with aviation degrees and years of general aviation experience, initially questioned whether she belonged in the program. But Sarah's unique background had eventually become an asset rather than a liability. Her understanding of passenger psychology, developed over 11 years as a flight attendant, gave her insights that purely technical pilots sometimes lacked. She could anticipate how passengers would react to turbulence, delays, and announcements in ways that helped her make better decisions about flight operations. Her experience with emergency situations had taught her to remain calm under pressure and to prioritize passenger safety above all other considerations. "Captain," David's voice brought her back to the present. "We're approaching our cruising altitude. Flight 2847 is performing normally and we're ahead of schedule." As they leveled off at 37,000 feet, Sarah looked out at the landscape far below. Somewhere down there, Thomas Chun was probably working in his workshop, crafting another wooden model airplane. Dr. Thompson was likely in surgery, using the crisis management skills he had refined during Flight 892 to save another life. Bill Patterson was teaching another community how to prepare for emergencies. spreading the lessons learned at 35,000 feet to people who might never set foot on an airplane. "I have an update for you," David said, consulting a message on his tablet. "Captain Rodriguez is retiring next month. He specifically requested that you be considered for promotion to training captain." Sarah was stunned. A training captain position typically required years of experience as a line pilot, but Rodriguez's recommendation carried enormous weight within Pacific Airways. Training captains were responsible for teaching and evaluating other pilots, ensuring that the next generation of aviators met the highest standards of safety and professionalism. That's incredible," Sarah managed. "But I've only been a captain for about 3 hours," David laughed. "I think your qualifications extend a bit beyond today's flight. The industry is changing, Captain. Airlines are realizing that experience comes in many forms, and that someone who's proven themselves in an actual emergency might have more to teach than someone who's only dealt with simulated crises." As Flight 2847 continued toward Denver, Sarah found herself thinking about the ripple effects of that September day. The FAA had implemented new training requirements for flight attendants, including basic aircraft systems knowledge and enhanced emergency decision-making scenarios. Several airlines had begun cross-training programs that gave cabin crew members exposure to cockpit operations and pilots. More comprehensive training in passenger management. The aircraft manufacturing industry had accelerated development of backup systems and improved emergency procedures based on lessons learned from Flight 892. The specific hydraulic failure that had crippled N892PA had been eliminated through design changes and enhanced maintenance protocols. But perhaps most importantly, the incident had changed how the aviation industry thought about unconventional solutions to extraordinary problems. Sarah's actions had proven that sometimes the best response to a crisis came not from following established procedures, but from individuals who were willing to think creatively and act decisively when lives were at stake. An hour into the flight, the head flight attendant, Jessica Wong, appeared in the cockpit doorway. "Captain, we have a passenger who's asked to speak with you. It's somewhat unusual, but given the circumstances. Sarah looked at David, who nodded his approval for her to step away briefly. In the first-class cabin, she found an elderly gentleman who looked vaguely familiar. As she approached, recognition dawned. It was Dr. Harold Blackwood, the FAA administrator, who had overseen the investigation into Flight 892. Dr. Blackwood, Sarah said, surprised to see him on her flight. "This is unexpected." "Captain Mitchell," he replied with a warm smile. "I specifically booked this flight because I wanted to be among your first passengers. I've been following your training progress, and I wanted to personally congratulate you on earning your captain's wings." They talked for several minutes about the changes that had been implemented across the aviation industry as a result of the Flight 892 incident. Blackwood revealed that the FAA was using Sarah's case study as the foundation for new emergency response protocols that would be implemented worldwide. "Your actions didn't just save 147 lives that day," Blackwood explained. "They've led to safety improvements that will save thousands of lives over the coming decades. The aviation industry is safer today because of what you did and what you've continued to do." As they began their descent into Denver, Sarah found herself thinking about Kevin Martinez, the teenager who had helped her rescue Thomas Chun from the smoke-filled cabin. Kevin was now in his second year of aerospace engineering studies, specializing in emergency systems design. His senior project was focused on developing improved evacuation procedures for aircraft with compromised structural integrity. The landing in Denver was smooth and routine, exactly as it should be. As the passengers disembarked, many of them stopped to thank Sarah personally, having learned during the flight that their captain was the famous Sarah Mitchell. But the most meaningful moment came when Alina appeared in the cockpit doorway one final time. "Captain," Alina said formally, then broke into a grin. Sarah, I have something to tell you. I've been accepted into Pacific Airways pilot program. If everything goes according to plan, we might be flying together again someday. Elena, that's wonderful news, Sarah replied, feeling genuine pride in her friend's accomplishment. You're going to make an outstanding airline pilot. I learned from the best, Elena said simply. You showed me that being a pilot isn't just about flying airplanes. It's about taking care of people and making sure everyone gets home safely. As the empty aircraft was prepared for its next flight, Sarah completed her post-flight paperwork and reflected on the circular nature of her journey. She had started as a flight attendant whose job was to ensure passenger comfort and safety. After a brief, terrifying period as an untrained co-pilot, she had evolved into a commercial airline captain whose responsibility encompassed every aspect of flight safety. But at its core, her mission remained the same: to take care of people and make sure they arrived safely at their destinations. David approached with the flight summary report. Captain, I have to say, that was one of the smoothest flights I've ever experienced. You made it look effortless. Flying should feel effortless when everything goes right, Sarah replied. The real test of a pilot comes when everything goes wrong. Today was a good day. We did our job and nothing extraordinary was required. As they walked through the Denver terminal, Sarah noticed a small display case near the gate area. Inside was a model of a Boeing 737, accompanied by a plaque that read, "In memory of Pacific Airways Flight 892 and in honor of the crew and passengers, who demonstrated that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when faced with extraordinary circumstances." The model was unmistakably the work of Thomas Chun, crafted with the same meticulous attention to detail as the one he had given her during the memorial flight. Seeing it here, in an airport where thousands of travelers passed by daily, reminded Sarah that her story had become part of aviation history. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Rodriguez. Heard about your first flight as pilot in command. Congratulations, Captain Mitchell. The passengers of Flight 2847 were in the best possible hands. Looking forward to working with you in the training department. As Sarah and David prepared to catch their return flight to Seattle, she realized that her transformation was complete, but her journey was just beginning. Tomorrow she would fly again, and the day after that, and for years to come. Each flight would carry the responsibility of keeping her passengers safe, and each landing would be a small victory in the ongoing mission of commercial aviation. But she would never forget that everything had started with a routine flight from Denver to Seattle, a hydraulic failure, and the decision to act when action seemed impossible. Flight 892 had ended her career as a flight attendant, but it had begun her life as a pilot. As Captain Sarah Mitchell walked toward her gate for the return flight to Seattle, she carried with her the lessons learned at 35,000 feet on a day when the impossible became possible through courage, quick thinking, and the unwavering determination to bring everyone home safely. The emergency was over. The investigation was complete. The transformation was finished. The real work of a lifetime could now begin. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.